Once upon a time, in a dark and stormy night about 2 years ago, there were 20 women. They weren't princesses, they were US senators. And the dark and stormy night was actually in the middle of the government shutdown. For the week before, all of the men in the Capitol and in the White House had paraded across TV screens and across the Capitol, blaming each other, recriminating each other, calling each other liars and cheats. And these 20 women gathered in this night for pizza and wine at Senator Jeanne Shaheen's offices, who's a New Hampshire Democrat, in her offices, and they were talking about how crazy this all was. Like, why wasn't anyone actually negotiating an end to the government shutdown? Why wasn't anyone actually talking to each other? Why wasn't anyone actually doing something useful rather than just blaming each other? And then they thought, well, why don't we actually, start to talk and reopen the government and do something useful? So they started a conversation. The next day, 3 of them went to the floor of the Senate, and they continued the conversation and said, here's where we agree, and here's where we think we can actually begin to talk. And 3 more women joined them, and then 2 men joined them. And by the end of the day, they'd formed a gang of 8 that within 3 days had reopened the government. So the point of this happy tale is not the happy ending that existed then, but as you can see, I wrote a story about it. I'm a journalist. And I actually didn't think that my editor would let me keep the headline, women were the only adults left in Washington, but he did. So what interested me about this idea was that it was the first time the Senate was 20% women. And they had a huge outsized influence. They ended up producing 75% of the major legislation that passed the Senate that year. That is a huge number. So to me, I thought, wow, how is it that women are having such a huge impact in the Senate? Well, it turns out that there's such a thing called critical mass. Whenever you have somewhere between 20 and 30% of women in any body, whether it's a legislative body, a corporate board, a Navy ship, an appellate court, and women really begin to have an impact. Well, critical mass, the idea of it comes from science, and it's actually the point of a chain reaction where you can no longer turn back. So essentially, with a nuclear reaction, it's the point in which you can't stop the boom. And in this case, women, it turns out, as I started to research this more and more, were already having impacts in a bunch of different areas in the workforce. So, for example, women on corporate boards, when you reached at least 3 on that corporate board, actually made those companies 24% more profitable. They were 26% more efficient. And those companies actually had to restate their earnings 55% less of the time. Women who were judges on courts had a huge impact on the way we judge. If you think about how judging has changed in the last 30 or 40 years as women have risen, they've become much more empathetic. There's been a lot more mediation, a lot more extrajudicial solutions, a lot more rehab and juvenile courts where it's not going on your permanent record. So they've really brought a feminine touch to the courts. And then you think about police officers. Women actually on police forces tend to exert much less excessive force, although notably the same amount of regular force. They draw their weapons much less than men do, and when they're partnered with men, those men draw their weapons less. And they're much better at community outreach. Who would not want that in an era of Ferguson and riots in Baltimore? So women actually are making a lot of progress, particularly in the public sector, but not so much in the private sector. The public sector, turns out, is reaching critical mass, this feminine tipping point, in all 3 branches of the government at about the same time, right now. So in Congress, you have 20% women. In the administration, you have 30% of government appointees and civil service appointees or civil service members who are women, and then 35% of the federal bench are women, and actually 40% of state court judges are women. The private sector has actually fallen behind. It's been stuck for the last decade at 17% representation on corporate boards and about 20 to 21% representation in executive offices. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, the unions in the public sector are much stronger. Secondly, women vote. Women vote a lot more than men do. They've actually swung every election since Ronald Reagan, and they vote on average 10% more than men. So when men are elected, or women for that matter, to office, they actually have to appoint women in order to show to female voters that they are representing them. And women have a much easier time on-ramping in the public sector than they do the private sector. Take, for example, New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen's home state. It has the most representative democracy in our country. So the lower house in New Hampshire has 400 members that represent 3 million people. It's a really easy leap to go from running for school board to running for state legislature. And it's a part-time job, as it is in 33 other states. So as women who have children, the children get older, they can take on more responsibility. They start to chair committees, they start to run maybe for state senate or for higher office. In New Hampshire, in the last 5 years alone, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, all 4 members of their congressional delegation, and half the state senate have been women. But, you may say, women already make up 47% of the workforce, and that is true, they do. But they make up 3/4 of minimum wage earners and 2/3 of shift workers. And that's not good. In order for women to truly have a broad influence, they have to permeate every sector of the workforce. Now, this may sound like a luxury right now. You hear a lot of companies talking about their women's programs and things, their women's efforts, and it's kind of half-hearted, or it's not really obviously that wholehearted because they're not making that much progress. But very soon it's going to become an economic imperative. So, women first entered the workforce during World War II. You may remember Rosie the Riveter. And that was because the economy absolutely needed it. If women had not entered the workforce, we would never have been able to win World War II. But it wasn't until the 1970s that all of the laws surrounding banning women or married women from working were fully repealed. And now we're about to enter another demographic cliff where women are going to have to come in and fully expand into the workforce. By the year 2030, the entire baby boomer generation will retire, and that leaves the U.S. with a shortfall of workers of 26 million people. There are 2 solutions to this. One, you can bring in more immigration, not very likely with this Congress. Or 2, you can bring women up to full employment, which almost completely solves the gap. Women actually already have the training for this. They account for more than half of college degrees and more than 60% of graduate degrees. They're just not putting that training to use right now. There are examples abroad of how women can actually, how we can sort of learn to permeate the workforce. For example, Europe has already reached this aging demographic cliff ahead of us, and they've instituted quotas across the board, not just in their workforce in terms of women on corporate boards and women in executive suites, but also women running for Congress and running for public office. Again, quotas, not something this Congress is going to do. So we have to look at other solutions. Japan, for example, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has instituted a womenomics program to help revive Japan's stalling economy. In Canada and England, they've done a program called the 30% Club, which aims to have women permeate 30% of the workforce, particularly the mid and upper levels. But the best example is actually Australia. Australia has a program, it is a really unfortunately named program, called the Male Champions for Change. But it actually is pretty effective, and I think it's actually it makes note of an important thing. Men have to be engaged in this process if women are going to succeed. It can't just be the women who get to that point and draw all the other women up behind them. You have to get men engaged in the process. What Australia has done in the last 5 years as they've reached this demographic cliff is to basically create a public-private partnership with the Prime Minister at the highest level, challenging all of the biggest companies in the country to report very transparently how many women they're recruiting, how many women they're training, and how many women they're retaining, even after they've given birth. And when they fall short of that, they get shamed. So it's actually been incredibly effective. They have actually more than doubled the women on corporate boards in the last 5 years, from 12% to 26%, and the women in their executive forces are reaching more than 40%. They're approaching critical mass, or not just critical mass, parity in Australia. So the next president in America, whomever he or she may be, will have to do something similar to this in order to address our coming demographic cliff. But it's not just about leadership at the highest levels. It's also about you guys and about anyone listening to this talk. Think about it next time you're hiring somebody, next time you're thinking about a position for a board that you're in, an organization that you're doing, or even if you're just asking advice from 6 of your friends. Don't ask advice from 6 of the same people who look exactly like you. Ask advice from all different kinds of people, because that advice will lead you back to the 75%. That will make you a great decision, and a much better decision than the one if you just asked for homogenous advice. Because it's only with grassroots activism and with activism at the highest levels in the presidency will we ever have a happy ending.